Two women in Georgia were forced to stand for 3 hours, hands bound with duct tape, simply for smiling at the same neighbor. At the center of it all was Beverly Glynn, the HOA president who treated her community like a kingdom and public shame like policy. But when a retired federal prosecutor stepped in and leaked emails exposed the truth, everything turned upside down. What started as quiet humiliation became a national reckoning, and the way justice was finally served will leave you stunned. It was just a smile, not the kind meant to provoke, not flirty, not rehearsed, just two women, tired, decent, human, sharing a moment of lightness under the Georgia sun. Kelly Rachels had just wrangled her golden retriever Baxter away from knocking over the mailboxes again. Her leggings were dusty, her coffee had spilled, and she hadn't slept more than 4 hours. Across from her stood Allison Marsh, barefoot, holding a rolled-up design magazine, wearing sunglasses not to shield from the sun, but from the remnants of last night's tears. Neither of them had planned to talk. But when Mark Sloan, the new guy, walked by with his giant sunglasses, Bluetooth earbuds, and a comically oversized smoker being wheeled into his yard, Kelly chuckled. "All that for some ribs?" Allison smirked. "Must be feeding the whole block." Mark laughed, guilty. That was it. Just a three-way chuckle, then back to silence, back to the regular morning. No one cursed, no one loitered, no one trespassed. But Summerdale Estates wasn't just any suburb. It was governed by one of the strictest HOAs in the state. Rules weren't guidelines. They were law, carved into stone by people who had nothing better to do than protect the character of the community. So when the certified envelopes landed on their doorsteps the next morning, both women assumed it was a mistake. Kelly opened hers first. Allison's came with hers later that afternoon. Notice of violation. Section 4.2, engagement in unsanctioned excessive social interaction with fellow residents without prior notification to HOA board. Incident recorded on April 3rd, 8:14 a.m. near Community Mail Drop Numbers 3. Corrective action required. Response due in 48 hours. Kelly reread it 3 times. Then she laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it felt too absurd to be real. Allison texted her within minutes. "Did you get this letter too? WTF is Section 4.2? Neither of them knew what was coming. They didn't know that smile would be classified as a disruption. They didn't know the HOA had cameras pointed at the mailbox, or that someone had filed a report within minutes. They certainly didn't know that their friendly conduct would be interpreted as a breach of community decorum initiated without clearance. In any other neighborhood, this would have been laughable. But in Summerdale Estates, HOA bylaws were gospel, and their enforcers, zealots in cardigans. What started as a smile was now labeled an incident, and the punishment was just beginning. Kelly thought it was a prank. She actually laughed when she saw the letter, tucked between an Amazon package and a vet bill printed on glossy HOA letterhead. It looked too ridiculous to be real. Allison laughed too. "What is this, the Scarlet Letter HOA edition?" she joked. They had plans to show up at the next board meeting and call it out. Maybe bring donuts. Maybe bring a lawyer. Maybe just walk out. But they went. And that's when everything changed. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse. Mahogany chairs, stale lemonade, and printed agendas on cream paper. Half the audience was retires with notepads. The other half were silent, watching. At exactly 6 p.m., Beverly Glynn entered the room like a judge in a courtroom she built herself. White blouse, string of pearls, matching clipboard. No smile. "We are here to address the violation of Article 4.2, she began, "and to discuss necessary corrective measures for the benefit of the community." Kelly raised her hand. "With all due respect, this is over a smile and a joke. To a neighbor." Beverly didn't flinch. "To preserve the harmony of this community," she said, voice clear and rehearsed, "violators will serve corrective standing time. 3 hours, hands bound, public property, signage required." Someone coughed. A paper rustled, but no one spoke up. Allison's voice broke the silence. "You want us to—" "What?" Beverly calmly elaborated. They were to appear on the main HOA lawn that Saturday, 9 a.m. Their wrists would be secured in a symbolic fashion, non-lethal but visible. They would each wear signage that clearly stated their offense. Failure to appear would result in a $5,000 community disruption, fine, and a formal notice of eviction proceedings. Kelly looked around the room. No one made eye contact. It was surreal, absurd, but real. Saturday came, 92 degrees by 9 a.m. The HOA lawn had been mowed the night before. Fresh stripes, not a leaf out of place. 2 folding chairs sat nearby, not for Kelly and Allison, but for the board observers. Beverly arrived 10 minutes early with a clipboard and 3 witnesses. The women stood side by side, duct tape around their wrists, tight enough to be uncomfortable, loose enough to avoid a lawsuit. Around their necks hung cardboard signs, hand-painted in HOA-approved font, I disrupted community order. Neighbors walked by. Some paused. Some whispered. A few filmed. A child on a scooter laughed. A teenage boy, someone's son, rode up and tossed a half-melted slushie onto the grass near Kelly's shoes. It splashed her ankle. He didn't look back. No one intervened. For 3 hours, they stood there, bound, silent, sweating, shamed. The heat bore down. The duct tape began to stick and pull at their skin. Beverly took notes. One board member offered a lukewarm bottle of water, but only once the timer ended. To the HOA, this wasn't punishment. It was policy. Correction, not cruelty. Order, not oppression. But to Kelly and Allison, it was something else entirely. A public ritual, a display of power, a warning to everyone else. This is what happens when you smile without permission. It started with one upload, a blurry, vertical video filmed by a teen from across the street. You could hear someone laughing off camera. You could see Kelly and Allison, wrists duct-taped, faces unreadable behind the sun's glare. The caption was simple. My HOA just did this to 2 moms for talking to the same dude. By nightfall, it was on Reddit. By morning, it had crossed into TikTok, stitched with commentary, reaction videos, and parodies. Then came Twitter threads, YouTube breakdowns, think pieces, memes, duets, podcast debates, even Instagram carousels with titles like When Suburbia Turns to Surveillance, The Dark Side of HOAs. Within 48 hours, the hashtag was everywhere. #HOA bending, #smiled and punished #. Duct tape justice comments flooded in. Are we in North Korea or Georgia? This feels like Handmaid's Tale cul-de-sac edition. HOAs are just legalized cults for control freaks. Plot twist, they smiled at the HOA president's ex. Someone called John Oliver. This is his next episode. The story took off because it was absurd, too absurd to ignore. People love scandal, but they devour absurdity that's real. The internet raged, joked, rallied, but in Summerdale, the vibe was different, colder, quieter. At Kelly's bakery job, her manager called her into the office. You've been great, he said, not meeting her eyes, but customers are asking questions. The owner's uncomfortable with everything. She was let go. No misconduct, just too much attention. Allison's daughter, Mia, came home from school early after locking herself in a bathroom stall. Girls had followed her around whispering, "Is your mom that HOA freak? You guys into like bondage or something?" No one at school did anything. At the grocery store, Allison overheard someone mutter, "That's the one from the video." The humiliation, the kind that was meant to last just 3 hours, followed them everywhere. Even at home, their inboxes were a minefield. Half sympathy, half hate. Some people called them heroes. Some called them attention seekers. Others said they were lucky it wasn't worse. Kelly unplugged her doorbell cam after someone rang it at 2 a.m. and left a duct tape roll on her porch. And then, right when it felt like they might drown in the noise, came the ping. Kelly opened her laptop and saw the email. Subject, legal inquiry, possible civil rights violation from Carmen Daly, sent 3:02 a.m. She clicked and read, and for the first time in days, her hands trembled for a different reason, because Carmen wasn't just any lawyer. She was a former federal prosecutor, and she wasn't reaching out for content. She was reaching out for justice. I saw the footage. I've reviewed the HOA bylaws. If you're ready, I'd like to talk about how we end this. For good. And just like that, the tide began to turn, not online, in real life. Carmen Daly was done. Done with courtrooms, done with deadlines, done with trying to fix a system that barely wanted to be fixed. After 22 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office, where she prosecuted civil rights violations and racketeering cases from New Jersey to Mississippi, she retired quietly to Asheville, North Carolina. Her law degree was framed but dusty. Her inbox was blissfully quiet. She had traded closing statements for gardening. She hadn't worn a suit in over a year, and then came her daughter. 17, sharp-tongued, politically allergic to apathy. She stormed into the kitchen one night, phone in hand, screen lit up with the now viral HOA video. "You always said America protects freedom." "This doesn't look like freedom, Mom." Carmen rolled her eyes at first. Another viral mess, another social media outrage cycle. But she watched, all of it. The duct-taped wrists, the sunburned skin, the signs around their necks, the HOA lawn, the silence from the neighbors. She didn't say a word when the video ended. She just opened her laptop, searched, cross-referenced, and by sunrise, she was making calls, pulling records, reviewing bylaws, digging into HOA codes and Georgia civil statutes like old muscle memory. By the time 72 hours had passed, Carmen was in Summerdale, Georgia, wearing a navy blue pantsuit she hadn't touched in 14 months, sitting in a small cafe across from two women who looked exhausted, suspicious, and more than a little broken. Allison was fidgeting with her napkin. Kelly had her arms crossed like a shield. Carmen didn't waste time. She opened her notepad, looked them in the eyes. "What was done to you wasn't just wrong. It was unconstitutional. They violated your rights under color of law. They used public shame as punishment without due process. That's not just a bad rule. That's federally challengeable." Kelly leaned forward. "Are you saying this is illegal?" Carmen nodded, calm. "I'm saying you've just become the face of a federal civil rights lawsuit." Silence. A breath held between what had been and what could be. "If you're ready," she said, closing her notepad, "we fight." And for the first time in weeks, Allison didn't feel like a punchline. Kelly didn't feel like a criminal. They felt like plaintiffs. And Carmen? She felt like a lawyer again. Carmen Daly wasn't building a media case. She was building a federal one. And she knew that if she was going to beat an HOA in court, an entity that operated like a private government wrapped in legal insulation, she needed more than outrage. She needed paper. The lawsuit was filed under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, a rarely used but powerful statute that allowed citizens to sue when their civil rights were violated under color of law. It was the same law used to hold rogue police departments accountable, the same law that once took down abusive school boards. Now, it was being pointed at the gates of a suburban HOA, and that by itself already made waves. But what came next would blow the whole case wide open. The email arrived anonymously. No name, no intro. Just an attachment and 5 words. She said more than that. Carmen scanned the sender's address. Masked. Secure. Likely a former board member, she guessed. Someone close to the inner circle. She clicked open the documents. Dozens of internal HOA emails, exported and zipped. Some were boring. Lawn maintenance, updates, sprinkler schedules, noise complaints. But then came a thread labeled Re-Disruption Protocol Mailbox Incident. It was dated just hours after Kelly and Allison's interaction with Mark Sloan. In a message from Beverly Glynn addressed to the full HOA board, if they're allowed to freely socialize, what's next? Yard sales, Bible studies, petitions? This is how disorder starts. We maintain structure through visibility. Humiliation works. Make them examples. Another email followed, responding to a board member's concern about legal liability. Our bylaws give us wide discretion. Public corrective action sends the clearest message. Soft consequences breed disobedience. There it was, in writing. This wasn't about protecting the peace or enforcing harmless rules. This was targeted control, a philosophy, a worldview. Carmen printed the thread, highlighted each line, and slid it into the growing binder titled Rachel's and Marsh v. Summerdale Estates HOA. She paused over one phrase in particular. Soft consequences breed disobedience. It read like something out of a dystopian novel, but it was real, suburban, American. That night, she called Kelly and Allison. They never cared about the rule, she told them. They cared about the warning. You were never the problem. You were the example. Kelly didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was steady. then let's be the example that stops them. And that's when Carmen knew this wasn't just a case anymore. It was a reckoning. Summerdale Estates was no longer just a gated community in Georgia. It had become the headline. By the time the story hit CNN's evening broadcast, it had already circled through morning shows, op-eds, and news apps. But it was the 6-minute segment on the women who were bound for smiling that pierced through the noise. The footage aired again, the duct tape, the heat waves rising from the sidewalk, the signs around their necks. Voiceovers explained how the corrective action had been authorized, how it echoed public shaming tactics. One anchor closed the segment with a line that would go viral. Some neighborhoods build fences to keep danger out, others use them to keep control in. The ACLU issued a formal statement that same evening. They called it an unconstitutional act of extrajudicial punishment and warned that private governance structures like HOAs are increasingly behaving like unregulated municipalities, with none of the oversight. Within 24 hours, petitions began popping up. Abolish abusive HOAs. Pass the Neighborhood Rights Act. Justice for Kelly and Allison. Tens of thousands of signatures. Law professors wrote open letters. Civil rights groups posted solidarity messages. Even John Oliver's team requested background materials. But not everyone welcomed the attention. Local officials, many of whom once praised the discipline of the Summerdale HOA, suddenly changed their tune. They released lukewarm statements about the need for updated community practices. One councilman simply tweeted, "We stand with residents." None mentioned Beverly Glenn by name, but they didn't have to. Her silence became deafening, and still, she refused to step down. She told one local paper, it was a correction, not a punishment. If people are uncomfortable with structure, perhaps they shouldn't live in structured communities. The quote backfired. Hard. While the board scrambled to do damage control, Kelly and Allison did something no one expected. They showed up, not in court, but in person. At a town hall meeting in Macon, they spoke side by side for the first time since the day on the lawn. Allison stepped to the mic. Her voice didn't tremble. "This isn't about duct tape," she said. "It's about how many people are quietly suffering behind HOA walls, afraid to speak, afraid to be seen, even afraid to smile." The room went quiet. Then came applause. Then came questions. Then came invitations to speak at university panels, civil rights forums, city council hearings. They weren't victims anymore. They were witnesses. They were advocates. They were, reluctantly but powerfully, leaders of something much larger than their neighborhood. Carmen Daly watched it all unfold from a hotel room in Atlanta, binder open, coffee in hand. She wasn't surprised. "You give the truth a microphone," she muttered, smiling, "and it learns how to sing." The tide was turning, and Beverly Glenn, once untouchable, was standing ankle-deep, trying to pretend the water wasn't rising. 9 months later, the doors of the federal courthouse opened to a packed room. There were no signs, no shouting crowds, just a silent line of reporters, legal interns, and quiet citizens who had followed the case from a hashtag to a headline to a courtroom. Inside, the air was thick. Cameras weren't allowed, but phones buzzed quietly with live tweets. The presiding judge was Honorable Miriam Estes, a seasoned federal justice with little patience for theatrics. She had read the briefs, she'd reviewed the exhibits, but when the video was played, the actual footage of Kelly and Allison, bound by duct tape, sweating under the Georgia sun, even she looked down and slowly removed her glasses. No sound in the courtroom. No coughs, no typing, just the faint hum of the projector as the video played, unedited, raw. Then came the emails. One by one, Carmen Daly read them into the record. Humiliation works. Make them examples. If they're allowed to freely socialize, what's next? Yard sales? Community disarray? Soft consequences breed disobedience. The judge stopped her. "I've heard enough. Continue with your summation." When it was Beverly Glenn's turn to testify, she walked to the stand with the same posture she once carried into HOA boardrooms. Confident, composed, pressed blouse, pearl earrings. But the courtroom was not Summerdale, and here she didn't hold the gavel. Her lawyer asked the expected questions. Beverly kept her answers clipped, controlled. I was maintaining order. I did what needed to be done. The community depends on leadership. Carmen stood, cross-examined slowly. No tricks, no raised voice. Just one question that landed like a stone in still water. Do you believe public shaming is an acceptable form of governance? Beverly hesitated. Just for a second. It depends on the context. That silence afterward, it was louder than anything spoken. The verdict came the next morning. In the matter of Rachel's and Marsh versus Summerdale Estates HOA, this court finds in favor of the plaintiffs. The actions taken by the HOA board, specifically those authorized by President Beverly Glynn, constitute a violation of civil liberties under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. This court awards damages in the amount of $1.2 million. Gasps, then silence. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, this ruling mandates immediate reform of the HOA's bylaws to bring them into alignment with federal due process protections. And finally, this court orders that Beverly Glynn be permanently barred from serving in any HOA or public leadership position within the United States. No applause, just quiet tears from Allison. Kelly squeezed her hand. Outside, reporters rushed for comments. Carmen declined, Allison didn't. This wasn't just for us, she said, voice calm. This was for every person who's ever been silenced by a rulebook designed to control, not protect. That afternoon, the Department of Housing and Urban Development announced it would launch a federal investigation into HOA misconduct practices nationwide. Summerdale had gone from a punchline to a precedent. Justice didn't come with fanfare. It came in the form of a gavel's echo. And for once, the sound of law had actually meant freedom. Kelly and Allison didn't walk away from the courthouse with just a check or a verdict. They walked away with something deeper, conviction. They could have disappeared, taken the settlement, moved to a new zip code, started over. No one would have blamed them, but instead, they built something. HOA Survivors Alliance launched 3 months later. It started with a laptop, a $500 website, and a single tagline written in bold, black letters. Just because it's private doesn't mean it's lawful. The mission was clear: provide legal aid, emotional support, and advocacy for people facing HOA harassment, abuse, and overreach. They weren't interested in burning HOAs to the ground. They were interested in drawing lines where no one had dared draw them before, lines that said, you don't get to fine someone for planting sunflowers. You don't get to shame someone for hanging a pride flag. You don't get to bind a woman's hands because she smiled at the neighbor. Within weeks, their inbox overflowed. Stories poured in from across the country. A man in Nevada who was evicted for refusing to repaint his garage desert beige. A veteran in Texas fined $200 a day for flying the American flag on a pole too tall. A family in Arizona forced to remove a wheelchair ramp in violation of elevation aesthetics. Some stories were frustrating, some were absurd, and some were worse than what Kelly and Allison had lived through. One woman in Florida wrote, I haven't parked in front of my own house in 5 years. Every time I do, they send someone to knock on my door. Another man in Ohio wrote, our HOA president installed cameras pointing directly at our windows. We feel like we're being watched, because we are. Kelly handled the intake emails. Allison organized weekly support calls, Zoom sessions where strangers cried, laughed, vented. Carmen Daly joined as legal advisor and began drafting model legislation for HOA accountability. The movement was no longer about one lawn. It was about liberty in the spaces people called home. The documentary came next. A producer from an indie film studio approached them after hearing their story on a legal podcast. The film, titled Order and Obedience: Life Behind the Gate, premiered at South by Southwest. It won an audience award. It ended with footage of Kelly and Allison standing on the same HOA lawn, this time holding a banner that read, "No more shame, no more silence." And still, they kept going. By the end of the first year, HOA Survivors Alliance had helped 93 families retain pro bono legal support, gotten 7 HOA policies overturned, provided mental health referrals to over 300 individuals. They were on panels, on podcasts, on Capitol Hill, but most importantly, they were heard. What started with duct tape turned into a movement. What was once an isolated shame became a shared voice. Kelly and Allison never expected to become activists. They just refused to stay silent. And in doing so, they gave language to something millions of Americans had felt, but never dared say out loud: home should feel safe, not ruled. Kelly didn't want headlines. She wanted healing. A few months after the court ruling, she enrolled in community college to finish the degree she had abandoned after her son was born. She majored in social work. She said she was done with HOA rules, but not with helping people. She still walked Baxter around the block, but now neighbors waved, sometimes nervously, sometimes sheepishly, always respectfully. Allison took a different path, she wrote. Her memoir, Bound But Not Broken, was published by a small press but exploded online. It was raw, unfiltered, filled with journal entries, court transcripts, and quiet moments from the days that nearly broke her. One chapter was simply titled, "The Silence Between Us," on the lawn. It hit the New York Times bestseller list in 2 weeks. Oprah called it a reckoning in paperback. Book clubs across the country used it as a launch pad to discuss everything from shame to control to the fine print in HOA agreements. HOA horror stories were no longer whispered on Reddit threads or traded in parking lots between neighbors too afraid to speak up. They were now broadcast, investigated, and increasingly stopped. Journalists began running full exposés on rogue HOA boards. State lawmakers pushed new bills to limit HOA power and require oversight. And for the first time, people across the country stopped asking, "What did the homeowner do wrong?" and started asking, "Who gave these boards the right?" Carmen Daly returned home to North Carolina with a case binder she refused to file away. She began consulting on civil rights education for legal clinics. When she was nominated for the Civil Liberties Defender Award, her speech was only 43 seconds long. She ended it by saying, "Justice isn't loud, it's consistent. And sometimes it starts with 2 women who just smiled at the wrong time." In Summerdale, the gates still stood. The lawns were still trimmed. But something in the air had changed. The community that once sneered, filmed, and judged now held barbecues on that same grass. Children played tag. Neighbors chatted without fear. And once a year, on the anniversary of the lawsuit, the HOA lawn hosts a new tradition: a community picnic. No permits, no dress codes, and absolutely no silence. No one talks about Beverly Glen anymore, but they do remember the sign, "I disrupted community order." Now it's a joke, a badge, a t-shirt, because the law is not a gated privilege. And a smile? A smile is not a crime. It's where humanity begins. And in Summerdale, finally, it's where freedom lives.